Hey, ladies and gents, and welcome to a spoiler cast. Well, not really a spoiler cast, I guess, but I'm going to be talking here with Logan Moore.
Hi, how's it going, Jared?
You've been on stuff before. Obviously, Logan writes at DualShockers. Do you write anywhere else? I don't remember.
No, I am at DualShockers now within a full-time capacity. So yeah, that's where all my written work you can find over there.
Awesome. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end as well. So this isn't really a spoiler mode. That's going to be going up with Dom, Jordan, and I talking about the game as it is and what we liked about it, what we disliked about it, and all that stuff, all the spoilers, obviously. This is more of like a wish list video. Logan and I are going to be talking about the things we want to see in the sequel. We're going to be talking about a lot of the gameplay stuff, but mostly a lot of the character dynamics and the narrative elements of the game. Obviously, though, this isn't a spoiler mode. It's going to be full of spoilers. So if you haven't played the game or you're worried about being spoiled, don't listen to this because there will be plenty of spoilers. I'm going to be talking freely about characters and a lot of things. Let's start at gameplay. So the first thing I want to tackle is combat. We don't have to get into necessarily too much of our personal review of the combat. But for me, I really enjoyed it. I like the combat a lot. So moving forward in the sequel, there can be some improvements to the combo system maybe and integrating gadgets a little bit more. But from your perspective, Logan, what do you expect in terms of the combat evolving in the sequel? Do we expect more finishers? What do you think about the combat in general?
Yeah, I think in general I really liked what they had in the base game here. I thought it allowed for a lot of experimentation and stuff like that, and I think a lot of people have kind of said that it's a little bit too one note and is too similar to the Arkham games. But I think there's a lot more that you can do to experiment with this, and it's a lot deeper than a lot of people give it credit for.
Agreed.
So that said, I think there's a lot of stuff in the game that maybe people didn't really know about or know how to take advantage of. So I think any new systems that can come about or any new mechanics in the combat that can really maybe shed a larger light on that stuff, like the aerial combat and things like that, I think would be great. Like the Electro and Vulture fight stands out to me as being one of the best sequences in the game, just because you literally don't touch the ground for a good 5 minutes there fighting all of them. If you're good enough at the game or whatever, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think more sequences like that would be really cool. Whether it be if they could find a way to add in some normal enemy types and stuff like that, and force you to do some more air combat stuff, that would be really cool. As far as other things that I think they would add in a potential sequel, more finishers and stuff like that seems obvious. And then new gadgets and stuff like that as well. Some of the gadgets in the game I wasn't a huge fan of. Some of them I really ended up liking quite a bit. So I don't know. It's Insomniac. They've always got really good ideas for how to make some cool gadgets for these games, going all the way back to Ratchet and Clank and Resistance and all those other games they've made in the past. So I'm sure they'll have some stuff like that coming up in the sequel as well.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned aerial enemies, and for me that's one thing that I personally want, because the only aerial enemies you fight throughout the whole game that are not bosses or whatever, just core enemies, are the Sable jetpack guys. And that was kind of disappointing because obviously a lot of the game in Spider-Man in general is centered around his air combat and his aerial maneuverability. So I would just like to see maybe more, not more factions, but the factions that we do have in the game, have them potentially have some aerial-based enemies. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be humans. It could be possibly them controlling drones that you have to fight, or maybe these weird mechanical robot-type things. Get creative with it, but I would like to definitely see more aerial enemies, because I think that's why a lot of people didn't understand all of the stuff you could do mid-air, is because you could easily, without not fighting the jetpack guys, every other enemy class, you could stay on the ground the entire time and fight them, and I think that's where people felt that it was very similar to Arkham. But for somebody I'm assuming you played the same way I did, where I try to take advantage as much as I can of knocking people into the air and using that to my advantage. And I think if you implement more aerial-based enemies, it'll give people the push to try out more of the aerial-based combat, because it's I'm being forced to do that. And I think that's why some people had complaints with the Sable jetpack guys, is because it felt so off to everything else, because that was the first time throughout the game that an enemy was aerial-based, And if you sprinkle that in a little bit more throughout the entire game, then it'll feel as more of a natural thing, if that makes sense. I don't know.
No, that I totally agree with you there. the way to go in this game, when I first really started learning how the air combo system works is when I really started feeling like I was understanding it. But again, the problem is I just don't think they really showed that off as well, and I don't think they really gave people as much incentive to utilize those combos that you can do in midair. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, more aerial enemies I think would allow for more experimentation with the combo system they already have in place, but I don't know. They'll probably add a lot more, just smaller tweaks, and I don't know. With a lot of these combo systems, it's just like a feel thing as well.
Yeah.
To use another example with the Arkham games, from like Arkham Asylum to Arkham City, like not that much changed, but the feel that is there within Arkham City, you can tell it is just a little bit tighter and a little bit, I don't know, a little bit more clean and polished up. And I'm sure that it'll feel the same way within the sequel here for Spider-Man.
The next thing I want to talk about, moving over from combat, is collectibles. So for me, I've never been somebody opposed to collectibles. Like, I'm never somebody who like puts my nose in the air. I'm that dude that'll go and collect the feathers in Assassin's Creed 2 just because there's an achievement attached to it. That being said, I'm also somebody who appreciates when you make collectibles worth it for people who aren't necessarily me, sorry, or give me a reason to actually go for them. And that's one thing I loved about Spider-Man, is that the backpacks, which are like the main collectible in the game, are very contextual. Like, every backpack you get, you find an item, and whether there's small context or large context there's always a reason why it ties to Peter, and obviously also Spider-Man, and I love that. I really enjoy the backpacks. The payoff for it of you getting the OG MCU suit, his original suit, is really cool too. It gives you more of an incentive. But I loved, like, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about later with characters. A lot of the tidbits and Easter eggs are based off of the backpacks or other collectible items. For you, do you feel that like the backpacks are enough to come back in the sequel? I mean, narratively that wouldn't make sense because you already collected them all.
Yeah, I don't think anything else that continues, any sort of collectible that continues to further flesh out the world that we find this iteration of Spider-Man in, I think is a good collectible. Because yeah, like, sometimes I go out of my way to collect collectibles in games, and sometimes I like hate the process of doing that, and I don't really know why I do it. This was something where I was like, oh, I'm going to get all the backpacks, and it was like a thoroughly fun and engrossing thing for me to do the entire time I was doing it. So anything similar to that, like you said, it doesn't have to be backpacks. Probably wouldn't make sense if it was backpacks. I don't know. There's a lot of different things they can do, but yeah, just that style of like, hey, this has given me more information on this world and this version of Peter Parker and this villain and blah 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 blah. Like, to further contextualize that stuff, I think is a really good idea, and I hope they continue to do that moving forward.
Obviously, this is a tough thing to think about because it all depends on what parts of Peter's past and, like, canonically what they pull from, right? So the backpack thing makes sense. That was a huge thing in the MCU universe, of him throwing his backpack and then losing it. One thing that I think would be an interesting idea, and obviously it could be a number of things, would be if there were like really old pizza boxes from when like Peter used to be a delivery boy, and it's just like you find these old ass pizzas, and I don't know how you would relate that contextually to everything else. I was just thinking of like, what's an object that there would be a lot of that he could find, and I was like, oh, maybe pizza boxes or something.
I was thinking like Daily Bugle clippings, maybe from when he used to be a photographer for them, or something
interesting,
like that.
Yeah. Instead of just getting the newspapers from the vending machine, like OG historical.
Like, oh, hey, I remember when I had this shot that was of the Rhino, or like, I don't know. They could all be contextualized because he took pictures of a certain event and it was in the paper or something like that. If that makes any sense. So,
this is partially going into the next part, which is the side missions. You just made me think of something of, obviously the photo challenges in the game were based on New York locations, right? It was buildings. It wasn't really having anything to do with the art of the city or anything like that. It was just like Easter eggs and buildings, right? Historical places, landmarks, that kind of thing. It would be really cool if there was, in the second game, there was a Banksy type artist who actually, every time a big event happened with Spider-Man throughout his history, he did a piece, like he did a mural on a wall. And that was one of the things you had to go out and find, is all of these art pieces that this artist did. And his whole thing is he creates art based on the event, and he's not necessarily biased towards Spider-Man. So some of the art pieces show Spider-Man in a good light, some of them show him in a bad light, and those would give you context too, because when you find the piece of art, that's when you can have some voiceover talking about what that art piece is referencing, I think that'd be pretty interesting, because Spider-Man has a lot of awesome art in it on the walls, but it doesn't have a lot of context for that art. So I would love if they pulled that into it as well. That'd be really interesting. In terms of side missions, so for me, my favorite, there wasn't a whole lot of side missions, which I'm happy with in one aspect, but I'm kind of bummed in the other. Because some of the side missions I really enjoyed, and some of them, it's not that I disliked them, I just think that they could have done more with it. Like the one of the main side missions, or the thread of side missions, is saving all of the kids who had been corrupted from the college, right? I think there's 4 or 5 of them. And 2 or 3 are cool. 5 of them, not that it got tedious, it's just I wish these other side missions could have been
it got pretty tedious. I mean, it was fine, but I agree with you. It was just rinse and repeat. It was oh, okay, same thing. Go to a different part of the town and web up all these people. Okay.
One of my main wishes for the side quests or side missions in the second game isn't necessarily that there's more of them. I don't care about more or less, but I want the tomb style type side missions, and what I mean by that is in Spider-Man, the tombstone missions it's a multi-layered side mission. So you go and you find out that some of his people are taking this inhalant, and you figure out it's tombstone inhalant, so they're actually becoming invulnerable, and you research that, and then it eventually leads to you fighting Tombstone. I like that it was multi-part. So one mission you were investigating, the second mission you were fighting people, and then figuring out more of it, and then figuring out how you can use that to your advantage to actually defeat Tombstone. And then the third mission was you actually fighting him. And I think that'd be a cool way to bring in lesser known villains, or lesser known storylines, and make it more interesting. And I think it's taking from Witcher, where you want to make your side missions just as interesting as your main missions. And as much as there's going to be obviously side missions where you're saving a kid or saving a kitten or something, but I really want the multi-part, multi-tiered, narrative-driven side missions, because I wasn't expecting to see Tombstone in this game at all. Tombstone is a villain we know about, but to the general audience, they don't know this random-ass mob boss. Usually he's very Italian mob, which is cool that they made him more of Sons of Anarchy biker gang. What do you think about the side missions in general, and what do you want from this sequel?
I thought most of the side missions were pretty bland, to be completely honest. I agree that Tombstone stuff was the best in the game. As far as, again, I hate to bring this up again already, Arkham does the side content correctly, in my opinion, where it's all centered around a certain thing, in the case of Spider-Man, centering all one series of side missions all around Tombstone. That's a good idea. They should have done another where they're centering them all around Kraven, or even the Taskmaster ones, even though they were just challenges. It was I enjoyed those as well, because it was still all centered. It all came back to Taskmaster at the end. I think that sort of character-driven side quest stuff is really that's what's really enjoyable to me, because it's all tied back to one character that you're familiar with, and it allows them to squeeze in more characters, whereas Taskmaster doesn't really make sense to throw into the main storyline or anything like that, but we can still throw them in the game because we've got this series of side quests and stuff. I like that stuff because it gets them to add more characters and things like that, and we'll talk about what characters I think we hope to see next later on. But yeah, because that was the one thing, is there's a lot of good villains in this game, but some of their appearances are rather short, especially once you get out of the prison break stuff. There's a lot of good moments with all the characters, but it's there's two boss fights with 2 of the characters, with Rhino and Scorpion, and then with Vulture and Electro, and you kind of take down that tandem of both of those tandems in the same boss fight, which kind of sucks. I would have liked to have seen them fleshed out a little bit more on their own. But yeah, there was just I think attaching a villain to a series of side missions is really, and that's what I've always enjoyed. That's why that's why I still think Arkham City is the gold standard for this sort of thing, or for superhero games in general. As far as iterating upon that, I don't know. It's weird because I know I bring up Arkham or whatever, and it's hard to just be well, just do what Arkham does or whatever, because that's a little bit of a shallow, not criticism, but suggestion, I guess. I don't know, stuff like that, because I agree that a lot of the side missions were, I don't know, not that memorable. I don't really remember too many of them after I finished the game, so.
Yeah, and the other two types of side missions I hope are in the game more are the stealth missions, because so during the story you do some stealth stuff, and then during the challenges you can do the first wave of enemies as stealth. But the Taskmaster challenges are the only place you can do a mission front to back completely stealth. That's what they're all center ground. Yeah. And I would love if there was more of that in terms of side missions, or maybe even integrated into the main story. I don't know, but I liked playing like stealthy in this game, and there just wasn't enough of it in my opinion. They don't need to go overboard, but being relegated to, I think it was maybe like 4 Taskmaster challenges that were stealth. Yeah. And I enjoyed those. I know some people had complained that they hated that you hard failed once you got noticed, but I'm like, it's a stealth challenge. I don't know what you expect. I had no issue with that personally. But yeah, I wish there was more stealth challenges, and also, or missions in general. I wanted to see a side mission with just being Peter. Like, one of my favorite parts of the main campaign is when you attend the Halloween party and you're in your Spider-Man suit, which is cool because you fit in or whatever. But I would love if there was side missions, maybe not a lot of them, maybe 1, maybe 2, I don't know, but at least a mission that takes place out of the main story where you play as Peter. I think that'd be pretty interesting. We'll talk about it later, but maybe those will be relegated to Miles if you end up controlling Miles, and we'll talk about whether or not we think that's a possibility. That could be a way they could handle it. But yeah, I want more variety, as well as I want more context and more narrative-driven stuff that actually matters. Because like we were talking about the college stuff, that's cool for like maybe 2 or 3 missions. I would like maybe 2 of like what's actually happening here. I do like that they don't tell you exactly where it is, and you kind of have to figure that out on your own. I like that aspect of it, but the whole narrative behind it is, oh, they're corrupted, go find them. And it's like, okay, I go there and I fight them, yada, yada, yada. There wasn't much to it. So yeah, the last thing I want to talk about before we get into plot is the open world. So I have a couple of questions for you, Logan. First of all, do we still think it'll be in Manhattan, but just larger? So do we think it'll still take place on the island of Manhattan, but maybe the scope of Manhattan in general will get bigger? And
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, if that's not the case, how do you think they're going to evolve their open world? Because there's a couple of ways they can do it. They can do it in terms of size, like I just mentioned. They can do it in terms of density, right? So I thought it was a pretty good Manhattan. I like the world. But they can maybe make it more dense, and obviously you could see inside some buildings, but a lot of it was copy and paste, which is still impressive, but like you see the same room over and over again. So they can make the city maybe a little bit more dense in its design. Verticality, so they can maybe scale it up so there's a lot, like everything is a little bit taller. So you can swing a lot, you can get more height and stuff like that, or depth, meaning that maybe there's like an underground level to New York City that you'll explore as well, like the sewer system or something. Like, how do you think they're going to evolve their open world? Because it was pretty impressive, and that's one of the things. Speaking of Arkham, they started in Asylum, which was small. I mean, relatively to the other 2 games, it was small. Yeah. Then they went to City, which, in retrospect, not speaking towards the narrative of the game or anything, but playing in that sandbox is weird to me, because knowing Arkham Knight and knowing Asylum, I like how small Asylum is, and I like how open Knight is, and City just feels like a weird in between. Obviously, it's a dumb statement. But so they went to City, and then they went to Knight, which was bigger than City, obviously. So with Spider-Man, what's the plan here? Do they go outside of Manhattan? Do they make Manhattan bigger? What do you think?
I think you really can't have an open world Spider-Man game that's kind of not in New York. That's the only reason I don't think they really shift the location that much.
Well, maybe what I'm saying in terms of not just Manhattan is not like Connecticut, but obviously other parts of New York, right?
Yeah, for sure. That was going to be my suggestion, is just open up the other boroughs, like allow you to also go to Brooklyn, cross one of the bridges and go to Brooklyn, or go to Queens, or like things like that. I think would be a good way to open the game up, because that's what the old Spider-Man games used to do. At least the PS2 one and Ultimate Spider-Man both did that. Like you started out in Queens or whatever, I think, just because that's where your house was. But you could go into Manhattan or whatever. And the scale of that was all much smaller. Like, even though all the different islands were in that game, obviously scale-wise it was smaller than what the Manhattan is in this game alone. I think if they opened up a couple of the other boroughs, that would make sense, because there's still a lot that you can traverse around, like in Brooklyn or whatever. So I think that makes the most sense. I really don't think you can. Yeah, I don't think you can set it in another location other than Manhattan. I think you do just kind of have to build on that area. I mean, like you mentioned with the Arkham games, like those all take place in Gotham, even though it's just Arkham City's still in Gotham, even though it's kind of its own thing or whatever. Yeah. It's just figuring out how to change the playground that you're in, and I have no doubt that they can do that. Plus, I don't think they really need to change the location that much. Like, it's one of those things where, like, just the simple act of swinging and going around the city is what people enjoy from this game. So if they don't really change that too drastically in the sequel, other than maybe, like I said, adding a new borough or something to go to, I don't think that's really going to bother a whole lot of people, because it's kind of just fine the way it is. And now, maybe if they made 3 or 4 of these games, that would be a different story. But at least for the next one, I don't think kind of reusing what they've already made is really going to bother a lot of people. I think this world is like, I could continue swinging around this world every day for an hour for the next probably year or so, and I would be fine. Like, it's that fun of a thing to do. So I think the world's fine as it is, and they can maybe expand it just a little bit more here and there. Allow you to get to some, I don't know, I would enjoy some things like in Spider-Man 2 where, like, there was certain ways that you could, like, get on Liberty Island or whatever like that. Like, if you attach to a certain helicopter, like, you could get over there. I'm not saying they do that exact thing, but I don't know, allowing you to kind of explore about a little bit more and try to maybe get to some different areas of New York City that weren't in this game or whatever.
Well, I would much rather, I'm with you on that. I would much rather have them polish up the world we already know in Spider-Man. So, like, making the cemetery more polished. That's just the first example that came to mind. Yeah, work on the cemetery first, the place where it's Peter's heartbreak. But, like, make stuff more detailed and higher fidelity in terms of how nice they look. Not necessarily like 1080 to 4K, but, polish up the textures and stuff like that and make the city feel even more high quality. Like, I think it was very high quality. I love New York City. I love Manhattan in that game. I hope they spend their time just polishing all that stuff up, because, like you said, I think people are okay with that and they love traversing that city, and familiarity is something great in video games. Like, that's one of the best things at the end of an open world game is where everything is, right? It's like you can just explore that place and you don't really have to look at the map that often, and you're comfortable in that space and you feel like you know that space. And I think if they just kind of polish everything up and make everything a little bit more detailed, Central Park, they can make that maybe a little bit bigger and maybe more interesting. But I'm not too worried about them changing too much about Manhattan specifically. In terms of going to other places, narratively they can do that. We're going to be talking about the plot and stuff moving forward, but if Norman Osborn had to move out of Manhattan, there's the reason to have one of the other locations available, right? If Harry or Norman are not living in Manhattan anymore, or other characters you're introduced to. And I don't think they're going to open up, like, all of those other districts, but I could see them. I think Brooklyn would probably be the safest bet. Like, if you told me, name the area that you think they'll add, the other district, I would say, and put money on it, I would say Brooklyn. That'd be my personal. Yeah,
I think Brooklyn and Queens are the two that makes the most sense, just because, like I said, Spider-Man is from Queens, so yeah. It would have more of that friendly, like, neighborhood vibe to it or whatever. Because that's the thing with, like, Spider-Man: Homecoming or whatever. Like, the scope of that movie feels very small because it's all in Queens, and Queens is not, like, it's in New York or whatever, but there's not a whole lot of, like, web swinging sequences like from the old Spider-Man films or whatever, where he's like just swinging through the sprawling New York City. Like, Homecoming's pretty small in scale. I think they could do some fun stuff there with that if they were to take it over to Queens.
So let's talk about the real interesting stuff, the plot. So we're going to be talking about it. We're first going to be talking about the credit and post-credit scene of the game first, and then we're going to go into specifically the characters and what we feel their character development, their arcs will be in the sequel, and then we'll talk about the villains. And at the end, I want us to basically pitch our own, what we think the sequel is going to be about. And it can be as long or short. I have a pretty lengthy thing I want to talk about in terms of what I think the game's going to be about. Yours doesn't have to be lengthy, Logan. I didn't prep you for this, so it's, if you have an idea you want to talk about, it doesn't need to be as long as mine. But, it is what it is. You can say as much or as little as you want. But in terms of the plot, so the biggest narrative thread at the end of the game is we have Norman Osborn walking into his own personal lab. That's the hidden room in his office, or his, I guess it'd be his penthouse, right? It wasn't really his, it was next to his office, but it was all part of his house. He walks in there. We see the Green Goblin bombs. So obviously they're alluding to him being Green Goblin. And then we walk up to this tank, this medical tank. We didn't know what it was when we first went in there earlier. I'm talking about just the average player. You saw some like spiders in there, so you're like, oh, they're trying to recreate the Spider-Man gene. And then you see this weird tank, and then you see all the Green Goblin Easter eggs. He walks up to it and he opens it, and the big reveal is that Harry was never in Europe. He was in this weird medical quarantine thing, and at first you're like, what's around him? Like, what is that stuff? Is it like fungus? Like, personally, at first I didn't think it was like the symbiote, just because I never associate the symbiote with Harry. So I was like, oh, maybe this is like a weird like Green Goblin origin thing. Like maybe he's gonna be infected or something, right? And then after you hear Norman Osborn talking about wanting to save his son, he puts his hand on the glass, and they've never confirmed it, but I mean, I think you're on the same page as me. It's 100% the symbiote. It's
1,000% the symbiote.
Yeah. So it reaches out and it touches the glass with him. Obviously, we're going to get into it later, but the two things I want to talk about is, one, Norman Osborn. We had the foreshadowing and the illusion that he is going to be the Green Goblin. He's old. He's like pretty old in this. What are the chances you think in the sequel Norman Osborn's arc is that he does become the Green Goblin, or do you think he's kind of past that now? It's going to be more of him driving Harry to that.
I don't know. I'm still torn on this afterwards. Somebody's becoming the Green Goblin, whether it's Harry or Norman. I don't know. But I don't know what the route they're going to go down. This game focuses on Norman a lot. Like, there's a lot of character development in there with Norman. So I think him being the Green Goblin would be most impactful.
Yeah.
Making Harry the Green Goblin would have the whole weight of, oh, it's your former best friend, blah, 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 blah. But Harry's really not in this game enough for us as the player to sort of have that connection. His relationship with Peter is always kind of talked about in a past sense, like, oh, wonder what Harry's up to, or Harry's in Europe now, blah, 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 blah. We were such good friends. And I've read the prequel novel too, so they kind of touch on that relationship a little bit more as well, but Harry's not really in that novel as much either. He's in a couple instances, and they kind of tip their hand at what's happening, what we end up finding out happens in the video game here. But yeah, I think Norman needs to become Green Goblin. I think that is just the logical thing. Obviously, like I said, somebody's becoming the Green Goblin in the next game. I hope it's Norman. Norman to me is the Green Goblin, even though there's been like 3 or 4 different iterations of the Green Goblin. I just think he's a very good villain, and he's already proved that he's evil in this game, and he's kind of unhinged in a lot of ways. I think there would just be a very good dynamic if the Goblin stuff just also made him lose his mind amidst all of that. As far as the symbiote stuff, I don't know how much we want to touch on that yet or whatever.
Loosely, top level, and then we'll go into it later in the...
I mean, I think they're obviously planning to do something with it in the next game. I like that it clearly seems to be organic and was created. The one thing I've never really cared for, or as somebody who grew up in reading the Ultimate Comics, the one thing I always liked with that was that the symbiote was like man-made or whatever. I never really liked that it just falls out of the sky from a crater, from space or whatever. I've never loved that. So I like that it seems to be man-made here, assuming that is the situation. And yeah, I would like to see them go down the Black Story route with the Spider-Man. Like, obviously everybody wants them to. A lot of people saw that and was immediately like, oh shoot, they're gonna do Venom, cool. And to me, I was more like, oh shoot, Spider-Man's gonna get the black suit in the next game, which I think opens up a lot of different avenues with what we've talked about so far with like combat abilities and things like that. Like they can do a lot of different stuff if they give Spider-Man the black suit in the next game, which is definitely what I want them to see them do. I think that would be super freaking rad. That's like one of my favorite story arcs in all of Spider-Man comics, which is which is ironic considering like before we started this we were talking about the Venom film and I was like, no, Venom looks like trash. I really like the Venom story arc in Spider-Man. I think it's like it's clearly one of the most well known. It's like one of my personal favorites. I would love to see them Insomniac's take on that, and Brian Intihar has kind of hinted as much that's the story. He said something along the lines of like, that's a story I think Insomniac needs to tell. So that yeah, I want to see Spider-Man somehow get the symbiote on him, and then from there, obviously, you can do Venom or whatever and have him be the bad guy at the end. It's a little bit choreographed, but I don't really mind that much because the story here in Spider-Man was pretty obvious as well. As soon as you saw Otto show up, it was kind of like, okay, well, I think I know the direction this game is going to go in now. But that was perfectly fine with me because I thought it was just the way they told the story was so well done.
Agreed. It wasn't that it was new or refreshing. It's that they told it so well. They
told it so well and fleshed out a lot of things that really don't get contextualized in normal Spider-Man, either comics or movies, whatever. Just the writing was so impeccable in this game, and if they were to do the Black Suit Saga with this writing and storytelling behind it, then that would be amazing, and they could do so many good things with that. So,
before we move on to the next thing, I agree with you on mostly everything. So Norman Osborn, I do think it's more impactful if he is a Green Goblin. All the foreshadowing and showing the green light on him and all of the different things they did in this game to be like, oh yeah, Norman's not a good guy. It would be weird for them to not go full bore with that and be like, oh yeah, but he's also too old and not interested enough to be the Green Goblin. It's like, well then why did you tease it, right?
Yeah, he's kind of got to be the Green Goblin in my opinion, and I think they're kind of trying to throw you off by making you think it could be Harry, but it's totally not going to be.
And I think that's the funny thing is I think in my opinion, I think in the sequel, I think we start that game, and we'll get into the specifics here in a bit when we talk about specific characters, but I think Harry is a red herring. I think that he's not going to have anything to do with the symbiote in terms of after it heals him and corrects him, quote unquote. I think that's it with the symbiote. I don't think he has any. I don't think he's Venom. There is a storyline where Harry becomes Venom, but I don't think that's the direction they're going with. I think him having the sickness was a way for them to organically make the symbiote, and then use it for future storytelling purposes.
That's I think the symbiote showing up in that scene as it does is more proof that just the symbiote exists in this universe and less proof that it is going to attach to Harry and become associated with him somehow, because that's not, if I had to take a wild guess, all of the symbiote gunk in this world of Spider-Man is not just located in that case with Harry. There's some more of it somewhere around, and it's somehow going to get loose, and it'll somehow probably attach to Peter, and so on and so on. So I think just that ending sequence to me more than anything was like, oh, okay, the symbiote exists in this world. Well, there we go. That's all the confirmation I needed.
It could be too that the symbiote doesn't see Harry as a good host, and it could be one of those things, and hopefully they do it in a good way, but it could be one of those things where Harry and Peter are hanging out and it attaches to Peter. You know what I mean? It just attaches to him somehow. I'm with you. I don't think this is Harry becoming Venom. We'll get into a lot of specifics I want to talk about in a bit, but yeah, I think we're both on the same page there. So real quick, this isn't a long question. How long do we think the time jump will be? So after the game, after the events of Aunt May passing away and all of that, there's about a 3-month. I think it's 3 months. Me and you were talking about before. We're not sure, and you said I think it's 1, 3, or 6, and I'm pretty positive it's 3, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so I think it's 3 months. That sounds right as well to me.
So obviously we're going to be having DLC. We're recording this before the DLC comes out, and you'll find out more about that later as we talk about the characters. But I say it won't be more than a year from whatever the end of the DLC is, if that makes sense. I don't think it'll be more than a year at the maximum.
Yeah, I don't think they can. I do want to say, I mean, we're going to get into it here in a second with Miles and stuff like that. I think they will kind of jump forward ahead to where Miles already kind of has some sort of grasp on his abilities, because I don't see them going down the whole teach you how to be. I'm going to teach you how to be Spider-Man thing. I think when we jump back into this world, it'll be kind of a he'll have kind of picked up a lot of things already, so we don't have to go through that tutorialization of teaching Miles how to be Spider-Man or whatever. That said, I don't think they're going to jump forward that far. I think there is a lot of things, almost in the sense of The Last Jedi or something like that, where there's a lot of good things happening already in this world that jumping forward too far in advance, I think, would be almost a mistake. I kind of want to see how things play out from this exact moment that we're at from here on out. In fact, 3 months is a perfectly fine period of time to jump forward, in my opinion, and we can kind of pick up in that neighborhood, because you would have to imagine things have already started kind of happening in 3 months after Otto gets put behind bars and Aunt May dies and all that stuff. Like, you would have to imagine things have started to kind of pick back up whether with Harry or Norman or whatever. There's other people around this world as well that are scheming and doing things, and there's a lot of narrative threads that they have not tied up. And I think, I don't know, they could do it. They could do a time jump, and it really wouldn't matter. Like, everything could be pretty much static to where it is right then, and it wouldn't necessarily matter.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think whether or not they say there's a time jump or not, I don't anticipate anything being all that different, except for Miles is really the only thing that I think will kind of change once the next game starts. I think he will already have a costume, and he will be a Spider-Man, and we'll go from there.
I think the baseline for the shortest amount of time they'll time jump, and it sounds so arbitrary and weird, but I think as long as it takes Harry to grow his hair back, because I think when we see Harry, he won't be like shaved. You know what I mean? It'll be like, oh, he has his normal hair. Because I do think there's going to be a thing where either Harry was like knocked out or like just is embarrassed by it, but I don't think Peter and MJ are going to ever know that he was in that tank. And the thing is, I don't know if Harry's ever going to know that he was in that tank either, you know? So it's going to be like, where does he
He knew what he knew what he was doing, though. I agree that I don't know if he's going to get out of it and have some sort of memory loss or something akin to Spider-Man 3. There you go. But I think he knew what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't really think he was going to Europe or whatever. He knew that he was getting in that tank or whatever for as long as it took to heal him or whatever. So I agree that I think he will get out of it and he will be quote unquote healed, but something will be wrong with him. And I think I don't know. I don't know what they're going to do, because there's a lot of things that I could guess. There's a lot of educated guesses I took before this game came out, and a lot of them ended up being wrong. I think a lot of them were wrong, though, just because I didn't know that Dr. Octopus would be in this world, and that was confirmed 30 minutes into the game, and that kind of changed a lot of my thinking moving forward.
Well, the crazy thing, too, is they did a really good job, and we'll talk about it later. They did a really good job explaining why Otto would need the arms, obviously his degenerative disease. Yeah. So I think they will do a good example of saying, like, oh, Harry's suffering from schizophrenia or personality separation, or like something to where,
or why would Norman inject himself with the serum, or why would he expose himself to those things, or
exactly.
They'll explain that stuff some sort of way that makes narrative sense as well, rather than just I don't know, I keep thinking of the stupid movies, we can't take it back to formula or whatever.
We don't have a whole lot of time, so I want to get through these character things real quick. Okay. So with Peter and Spider-Man, really quick, how do we think Aunt May's death will affect Peter moving forward? And another, I think, is a pretty important question, where will he be working at the beginning of Spider-Man 2? Is he going to be back at the Daily Bugle? Is he going to be at Oscorp for some reason? And that's another way where he can get in touch with the symbiote. Obviously, if he's like around that area. Like, what do we think his job's going to be?
Parker Industries. There we go. Take it back to the comics. I'm just kidding. I was
going to say, I really hope they don't do that either.
No. I don't know. I think it would be cool if he went back to the Bugle, just because I like Spider-Man stories where things are as they should be. Like, and I know that this was something that annoyed the comic book fans for a very long time, probably over the course of the last, 100, 150 issues, until the most recent relaunch of The Amazing Spider-Man. Is like they kept having Mary Jane and Peter not be together, and fans are just like, why are you doing this? Just get them together. They're supposed to be together. Just make things normal. Like, I would be totally fine if the next game starts and he's like, oh, I'm back at the Bugle and I'm dating Mary Jane. It's like, okay, everything is as it should be in this version of Spider-Man. Like, I'd be totally fine with that.
Yeah.
So I guess my desire is for him to work at the Bugle. As for what he will be doing, I don't know. It's hard to say. There's a lot of different things they could set up, a lot of different science people, things they could mess with. I don't know. I don't envision him working for Oscorp, because as we kind of learn over the course of this game, Oscorp is totally corrupt and evil, and Spider-Man knows. Peter knows this because he's Spider-Man. So whether the larger public is aware of this or not, Spider-Man knows that company is pretty scummy, so I think he's going to not want to work for them. So I do not envision him working there.
My only into that is that Harry. Like Harry, what if Harry's like, "Hey, Peter, sorry about everything that happened, but I know you're really into working on stuff. What if do you want to come work at Oscorp?" You know what I mean? And that could be the in there of him like, "Oh, okay." You know, him knowing that it's corrupt and stuff, but it's like, does Harry not know about that? Does he want to inform Harry about that? You know what I mean? And that could be the into Oscorp. I'm with you though. I'm for Daily Bugle. Like that's my number one. I want him back at Daily Bugle because then that even gives more context to the photo challenges and stuff, and they can open up a lot more there.
Yes.
And there can even be you can even have missions or side missions or stuff where you're Peter and you can't intervene in what's happening, but you have to photograph it. Like there's some reason why you can't intervene, and you have to kind of solve the situation without being Spider-Man. That'd be really interesting. MJ, Mary Jane. So will her and Peter be together at the beginning? We both are probably in the... This isn't a long answer. It's yes, right? We assume. That's what we want anyways, for them to be together at the beginning of this thing, especially considering the time jump. Do we expect her to be running the Daily Bugle? Obviously, she's not leading it. I think she's one of the head editors there. I don't remember if they gave any specifics. Obviously, she works at the Daily Bugle.
In the book, they make her cover like culture stuff. Like I think they mentioned like dog shows or something like that. I think she just gets promoted more to like the main news desk.
Yeah,
something
not
like that by the end of this game.
Head editor or whatever.
She's just allowed to cover like actual stories and not like fluff piece crap.
So
whatever.
I have a question for you because this was something Jordan and I talked about on our podcast. He wasn't a huge fan of the MJ stuff. Not that he doesn't like MJ, he just feels that there was no reason. Like they should have, the parts that they had you playing as MJ, he didn't feel were earned. Like he wishes they would have done different stuff with her. So, in my opinion, I would be down if in the second game she didn't have any playable parts, and a lot of those other parts that were taken up by her are taken up by either Miles or because obviously Miles was playable too in this game, or just Peter Parker. Like I'm fine with MJ not being a playable character. And I understand why they did it because it gives you different context, but she didn't do too much different that you didn't do with Miles. So maybe I'm kind of arguing against myself here, playing devil's advocate. Since Miles is going to be a Spider-Man, maybe since you're not going to be having really those walking around parts with Miles, maybe then her parts become even more important because it won't be split up between two characters, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. There was like a flow issue with me. I didn't dislike Mary Jane's parts of the game because I actually like enjoyed the narrative through lines in her missions and stuff like that, and I enjoyed that it felt like it was a good reminder that like, oh, not everybody in this universe has like superpowers that swing from tall buildings or whatever. So that was like a good reminder, and I think it helped keep the story grounded a little bit more. Yeah, it was more just like a flow issue, I think, or not even necessarily an issue. I don't know.
My only gripe with her missions was that when I think Mary Jane, I don't think stealthing through an area, right? I just didn't feel like Mary Jane to me. I would have loved if her missions were, she's a journalist. Put me in an open space with her and let me go detective mode. Like, let me figure out a situation. And they had parts of that in it, but I would love if there was just sections where you're Mary Jane and you have to figure things out using your intelligence, right? And her journalist skills. That would be cool. And you, maybe not dialogue trees with people, but you kind of pull things together and you figure out a situation, you go detective on it, and you go journalist on it. So it feels like Mary Jane, you know? It was just like, there was a detachment for me of like, I didn't mind her missions, really. Jordan was the one that was really against it. But I just didn't feel super Mary Jane-y.
Yeah, you're right. It didn't feel like her necessarily. Yeah, I don't know. They just spice them up a little bit, make them almost more interesting because, it was just all mainly stealth-based, which it doesn't need to be moving forward. Just spice up the kind of style of gameplay it'll be or whatever.
So, Miles Morales. Are we both in the camp that we think we'll play as him in Spider-Man form in the sequel?
Oh, 1,000%, yes.
Agreed. So... we don't have to go too long on this, but in terms of what his arc should be in the sequel and how can they make the typical hero learning powers arc more engaging and refreshing, you touched on it earlier that you assume that he's going to have his powers and he's be comfortable with them because it's not going to make sense contextually. I mean, that could be a way they do the tutorial for the game at the beginning, but like moving forward, there'd be no point for him to be that unfamiliar. Maybe you do the tutorial before the time jump, like, you know, maybe the beginning of the game is a cold open to where you're Miles like kind of a little bit after he got bit and he's in his Gen 1 kind of crappy suit and then there is a time jump. That'd be pretty interesting. But I think with him, the most interesting things with Miles will be not learning how to be a superhero. It'll be learning how to balance it, right? Because that's the whole thing with Peter and Spider-Man is balance. He's terrible at it. So it would be really cool if you see it from a younger perspective, because Peter's been Spider-Man for 8 years, 9 depending on when the game comes out, the sequel. I think that's what they need to focus on, of his balance with being Miles and being a Spider-Man. And if Mary Jane and Peter are going to be kind of strong, like, in terms of a relationship in the sequel, young love is always a funny thing to write, and they could do that really interestingly, of Miles like not really having a girlfriend. And we kind of got a touch of his friends in the game too. Remember when he first learns how to punch from Spider-Man, his friends like, did you show him our hacking app, you know? So
yeah,
it'd be interesting if and we'll get into this one at the end of the show when we talk about the plot for the second game, but if a lot of the interpersonal relationship stuff is handled with Miles, like if we figure out like a lot of the narrative through him instead of Peter, because things are kind of going swimmingly for Peter until the symbiote and stuff like that. So I don't know. What do you think about Miles? Like, what do you think his arc is going to be in the second game?
I think it'll be a lot of a lot of what you were saying there. I think there is probably going to be a learning curve and stuff like that. As far as his role in the story, I don't really know. I don't know. It's hard for me to think of how he fits in with all of this. I think gameplay wise, I think it'd be smart if you could like freely switch between him and Peter, and each of them played very differently, because Miles has got different powers and stuff like that. He can like go invisible or like become camouflage or whatever. He's also got his like venom touch thing or whatever that's called, where he like zaps the snot out of people. So there's like very different ways I think that each of them could play. If they went down like a Grand Theft Auto 5 route of you could just like freely switch between each of them in the open world, I think that'd be really cool. As far as how he fits in the story, I don't really know, because it feels like this game has kind of opened everything up to a very not a super large scale, because it's remained pretty intimate with between the core group of characters and stuff like that. But I think if they hone in too much on his own struggles of being Spider-Man and stuff like that, it could be a weird dynamic. I don't know. I think whatever Miles' story arc becomes in the second game, I think a lot of it's going to be shaped by Peter. And like, hey, you should not be Spider-Man. You should not be going out. I don't know if he'll want him to go out into those situations, or if he'll be encouraging it to like, yeah, come be Spider-Man with me and we can take down bad guys together or whatever. Yeah. Like, I'm curious. I don't know. Miles is like the one character I don't really know what they're going to do with him moving forward. I also don't have a ton of like background on Miles. I haven't like read all his comics. I've read like his core comics, but like I just don't. They could do a lot of different interesting things with him, and I don't. I guess the larger question is I don't know what they want to do with Peter moving forward. So I don't really know what they want to do with Miles in turn.
So I can't wait to get to the pitches, because I've thought about this a lot, and I really. What I think they're going to do, I think makes Miles kind of important to the narrative. And I agree with you, sitting here now, it's like, well, how is he going to fit in? But like thinking about it, I kind of have an idea of how it could possibly work. And obviously we're just theorizing. We don't know, obviously. Harry Osborn, we kind of touched on this. So we don't really need to talk about it too much. What are the chances we start Spider-Man 2 and he's back to normal with Peter and friends none the wiser? We're both like, yeah, it's probably going to happen. He's going to be just, trying to act.
Well,
normal.
they know he didn't go to Europe, so they know something will be up. So if he shows up, both Peter and MJ will be like, "Dude, what the heck? We know what happened," and I'm sure they will approach him about that.
Well, they don't know he was in the symbiote, though. Yeah, they do know that he didn't go to Europe.
They don't know he was in that one case. They know he like went to go get healed or cured or whatever. They just know that he like his cover story was a lie.
Yeah.
Mary Jane didn't know he was in that giant case or whatever when she was in that lab, even though I did. As soon as I walked in there, I was like, oh, he's totally in this thing right here.
Yeah.
So,
this object's like weird and large. Why is it in here? Oh.
Yeah. He's gonna show back up somehow. And then that's I think the kind of the ground roots of the story they're going to tell in the next game is going to be him probably coming back into Peter and MJ's lives, and then they'll go from there with whatever direction they want to go in.
So Yuri obviously was your main point of contact in the game. I thought she was voice acted very well. She's one of my favorite characters from the game. Really liked how they did Yuri. So do we kind of expect her to have I talked about this before we started recording, the Commissioner Gordon thing, where in the sequel she's probably going to be promoted to a pretty high position? And I mean, that's going to have a lot of factors in terms of whether or not she's going to be your point of contact with the police department.
Yeah.
And before I want to get your feelings on that specifically, but I want to talk about real quick. So in Superior Spider-Man, she becomes Wraith, and the arc in that can be implemented in the world that they've created in these games really easily. So for those unfamiliar, I won't go into a huge tangent about it, but in that comic, basically what happens is Tombstone, which we've already been introduced to, right? And he said, I'll see you next time, so we'll talk about that when we talk about villains, but he's probably going to be back in the sequel. Tombstone and his gang are holding out this area, and the cops pull up, Yuri's there, and there's a shootout, right? Yuri's police chief dies. He gets shot and killed. So, obviously, Yuri gets pissed off because she was close to that guy. What ends up happening is they arrest Tombstone, okay? Then, Mr. Negative sends Yuri information letting her know that, because Tombstone gets arrested but then he goes free, Yuri gets information from Mr. Negative letting her know that the judge who ruled over Tombstone's case is actually buddy-buddy with Tombstone and a bunch of villains. So that pisses her off and she wants to take matters into her own hands. And it's kind of that storyline of like, oh, everything's corrupt, right? What am I going to do when things are corrupt? And the storyline advances from there. In that series, she gets her suit from old Mysterio stuff and Chameleon equipment. And she's already kind of touched on them knowing where equipment is with Black Cat obviously in the game. So there are a lot of threads there. And at the end of the story arc, Mr. Negative blackmails her. And the whole relationship with her and Peter is she's way too violent. And that's where Peter kind of falls with her, is like, whoa, you're taking things too far kind of thing. That would be an interesting narrative thread because we already have Mr. Negative. We have Tombstone. There's a lot of stuff there where you can play into it where Yuri can become a more prominent character and become like the anti-hero, you know? I just thought it was interesting because there's so many threads in this story specifically that we know of Tombstone and Mr. Negative, that those are two obscure characters. So for them to also be in this world and have some story beats, it's a possibility. So, but in terms of what you think, what do you think Yuri is going to do in the second game, in the sequel?
I think she should just kind of fill the same role she filled in this one. All that stuff is good in the comics, but yeah, I don't know. I think it could do... my fear for the next game is that they do too much with that sort of stuff, because you're right, there are a lot of options in this universe, and there are a lot of things for them to do. But yeah, I think if they were to add in all that stuff, it would almost be too much, because we already know that we've got Goblin stuff likely coming, we've got symbiote stuff likely coming. To add in the Wraith storyline as well within all of that, I think would be a little bit too much. Plus, assuming they go down the black suit route, Spider-Man's probably going to be the one who, in that situation, who's becoming a little bit too aggressive and who's becoming a little bit unhinged.
I would love the threads for maybe the third game. Like, put the threads in this for maybe a possibility of it in the third game. I agree with you, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would just get a little bit too bloated if they added all the Wraith stuff in there. So I'm fine with her continuing to just sort of fill that inside man role within the NYPD and keeping that moving forward, at least in the next game. Yeah, I don't know, like you said, if there's a third game, which, assuming how well this one is selling already, I'm sure they probably want to make 10 games. I don't know. I think there's options with her moving forward, but maybe not in the next one, because the next one's already kind of... seems like we know what we're going to get in that one.
I think we get 3, in my opinion, this is something we're not going to necessarily go fully into, but I think they're going to do 3 Peter games and then 3 Miles games.
That would be interesting.
That's my assumption. And I don't think the Miles games will take place in Manhattan. New York, but not Manhattan. Because in recent interviews with Bill Roseman and stuff, they're talking about, like, we want multiple games in this universe, and they didn't specifically say, like, Peter games or Spider-Man games. Like, they just said we want multiple games in this universe. So, like, that leads me to believe, like...
they're just talking about broad Marvel, I think.
No. They were talking about specifically with Insomniac and Spider-Man. They said, the universe Insomniac created, we want to make multiple games in this universe. So
Okay, so they were only talking about the Spider, because I just
yeah.
assumed they were talking about like every Marvel game they make from here on out is going to be tied back to this.
No,
So
no.
because they talk about the Avengers in the game and how what Peter says something about how like they're on the West Coast or something like that.
Yeah.
There's ties to like there's nods to a larger universe. Doctor Strange in the game. There's a Wakandan embassy. Like there's larger things in this world that I figured they were just pointing to. When they talked about a larger Marvel universe, I figured they were talking about other Marvel characters entirely and not just this Spider-Verse or whatever.
They had that quote. You're not incorrect. But they also had a quote when they were specifically talking about Spider-Man, because somebody was asking about like the reins they gave for Spider-Man specifically in the universe they built and the lore there. They said this universe that they created with Spider-Man is super interesting, and we think we can create a lot of great titles in this franchise. They like specifically said that. So
yeah,
it leads me to believe that we'll probably get a Miles game. Anyways, the smaller characters before we get to the villains, because I don't want to run too long. J. Jonah Jameson, will he be more of a voice? Should he be? My opinion, I'm fine with him just being the podcast guy. I don't need J. Jonah Jameson as a fully voiced, modeled character. I'm fine with it.
Yeah. No, I think he's fine as he is. It's fun.
Yeah. We were going to touch on Silver Sable, but one of the DLCs is called Silver Lining, so I don't want to touch on Silver Sable or Black Cat because they're going to be part of the DLC, and we could make points that don't matter by the time those DLC come out. So we'll leave those as are until we find out more information. And lastly, do we think Feast will be a part of the storyline in the second game at all? And if so, who will be running it, as well as will Miles be there? Obviously, Feast is the place that helps out homeless people or people in trouble. Mr. Negative ran it, Martin Lee. Then Aunt May took over, and she actually helped before he left. And Miles was helping there. Do we think it'll be a main storyline there? Part of me wants to say yeah, because there's such an attachment to Aunt May that Peter might want to keep ties to it, you know. But part of me is like, well, maybe that was just in the game to show the connection Peter and Aunt May have to helping people. And maybe it's actually hurts Peter more to even be connected with it, you know, because it reminds him so much of Aunt May. So it can go either way there.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it obviously won't play as large of a role in the next game. I think it might just be like a side thing that they kind of mention, like, oh, Feast is now operated by so-and-so, and they've changed the name of it or something like that to distance themselves from Martin Lee, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I don't know, something like that. Like, I think they'll passively mention it. I don't think it'll be like a huge through-line narrative, though, of like visiting the Feast centers as much as you were in this game, because that was like every 3 or 4 missions it seemed like you were going there.
Let's get to the villains. So we don't have to talk about all of them at length, but I want to briefly talk about them and if we expect them in the sequel. So we're going to go in 3 different categories: known, returning, mentioned or teased, and then unknown but possible. So first off, we have Norman. I don't think we need to go too much on him. We've kind of already covered him in terms of him possibly being, or more than likely being, Green Goblin, and him being a major crux in the narrative for the second game. Mr. Negative, I think we could possibly see a cameo or a mention of him, but I don't think he's going to be featured in the sequel at all. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, it's just more about that. Like, I think if they throw in too many, then I think it gets a little bit too busy. Again, they'll probably talk about him and throw some nods his way, just acknowledge that he's still in this world. But yeah, I don't think we see him.
Yeah, Doc Ock, same thing for me. I think because he was such a huge narrative part of the first game, I think that he's going to be mentioned. We're going to know what's happening with Doc Ock, but I don't think he's going to be a part of the main story at all.
They do dwell on him when he gets locked up at the end of the game, leading you to believe that, like, don't forget about Otto. He's still going to be in this world, type of thing. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how he would fit back in necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I don't know. See, like, I think Doc Ock is like the biggest Spider-Man villain out there, like even bigger than Green Goblin in a lot of ways. And I don't know. Maybe the history of the comics don't say that. I know Norman's probably like his real arch villain or whatever. But I think Doc Ock has got his hands on like a lot of things in the Spider-Man world a lot of times, and I could see him still kind of doing some shady stuff behind the scenes or doing. I don't know. I think he will. I'll just say this in like a very broad sense. I think he will still have a very not very large. I think he will still have an impact on what happens in the second game, whether that means in some sort of side content or whether that is with the main plot line. He will still be involved somehow, I think.
Well, it'd be interesting if he was part of creating the symbiote or whatever, and his whole thing in the second game is he was part of corrupting both Norman and Peter, right? And he kind of he gloats about that of like, I've corrupted both of you, you know, if Peter ends up donning the black suit. Kingpin, I want to have like another fight with Kingpin because I actually enjoyed his fight at the beginning of the game, but I could totally see him just not being in the game. Like, he'll be mentioned. I think he might end up being the mayor again if he gets out. I could easily see that happening the way as corrupt as Kingpin is now that Norman's not mayor. I could easily see him being mayor again. Do you think we'll see Kingpin at all?
I don't think so. I don't think they should. I think him being locked up is what kind of allows everybody to kind of run crazy and fight for the city or whatever. I think it makes more sense to have him locked up. Again, they'll probably mention him off to the side every now and then, but yeah, that'll be about it.
I would love if we get a mention of him running it, because we know, like, obviously Nelson and Murdoch and Alias Investigations. It'd be cool if we heard about him trying to do something, but he gets thwarted by, like, the Defenders or Daredevil specifically, you know, to where, like, he does something, but he gets handled by somebody who's not Spider-Man. That'd be interesting.
I was going to say maybe he gets out, but maybe what he's doing is more on a low-key scale rather than, like, on a large-scale operation, and maybe you can do, like, a side mission series where you team up with Daredevil to take him down or something like that. Like, something like that would be cool. I don't know how feasible that is, but...
In the third game, we could totally see Kingpin reemerging as the mayor and putting the city on lockdown, right? And that could be a huge thing of, like, yeah, it's safer, but to an extreme extent, right? Where he has people controlling the streets or whatever. Who knows? That might be similar to Sable, but Electro. I think Electro was used enough in this game. Out of the next 4 villains we're going to talk about, I think he was used the most, and I think I'm cool with not seeing Electro again, personally. Like, I think we had enough of him in this game that I'm fine with him not returning.
Yeah, we can go down that list here. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I think Electro, Vulture, Scorpion, and Rhino really don't all need to make an appearance in the second game.
I think Vulture has the best case because Electro was used a lot. Scorpion was used a bit. I think out of these 4, I think it was Electro that was used the most. Then it was Scorpion, especially with like the hallucinogen stuff. Then it was Rhino. His big thing was the Miles mission, right? And then Vulture didn't have that at all. Like, the only time you fought Vulture was at when you fight Electro, because you didn't fight him at the raft, you know? So I think Vulture's the only one that has a case to be brought back, but I'm with you. They cannot return. I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I think... yeah, I agree. I think Taskmaster in the same sense, since I know we're headed that way, I don't think Taskmaster needs to show back up necessarily, unless... In fact, actually, I will say what I would like to see Taskmaster show back up in is another Marvel game, like if he was in the Avengers game or something like that. Yeah. I think that'd be cool if he was kind of like a traveling villain who bounces around to all these different areas. However, he does cite that somebody hired him at the end of this game to come after Peter in this way, and I don't know if that's something that's going to be fleshed out in the DLC or in a following game. Curious to see who hired Taskmaster, but it might just be like, I don't know, it might be a dead end.
I read it as the Avengers, personally, because the way he talks about, he's like, a team hired me to see if you're worth it or whatever.
Yeah. I read that as the Avengers as well.
Tombstone, I talked about how I enjoyed his side mission. He said at the end of it, I'm going to be returning. I loved when he entered the story because he introduced the motorcycle enemies, and I love throwing those motorcycles around. So for any point, I just hope he returns, that way those enemies return. But I am interested. I would love to see him return in a side mission, because he is one of those like C-tier villains that isn't interesting enough to throw into the main campaign as like an actual villain. But I do think they used him effectively in the side mission, you know. So, but if he's replaced by like other C-tier villains that also have those really cool side missions, I'm fine with that as well. I just don't want him being removed and us not getting any interesting side missions. That's like my worst case scenario. So he could return or he could not, but we'll see. I agree with you, Taskmaster. He could also return in a way where he does the same thing but to Miles. You know, not necessarily getting hired,
that'd be cool.
But it could be like, okay, I couldn't handle the other Spider-Man. Let's see if I can study you and defeat you, right? That would be a cool way to introduce Taskmaster back. Mentioned or teased. So Morbius. I forgot the name of the scientist's name, but the black scientist who has the suitcase with Devil's Breath. One of the main side characters of the game. He's the one at the end of the game that creates antidote for Devil's Breath. That's the alias of Morbius, the living vampire. The weird thing with him is his Easter egg. I don't know if it's just they use his alias and they never plan on using Morbius, because I don't know if I missed anything, but there was zero foreshadowing for him being a vampire. I don't remember.
Because that's kind of... Morbius is such an outlandish villain. Like, I almost feel like... I want to say this first. I like Morbius a lot. I think he's a fun villain, but I also at the same time think he's kind of overboard for this universe.
Yeah.
They're trying to craft here. Maybe if it was all of a sudden like, oh, there's a vampire, then it's just kind of wacky.
I've always read him as a better foil to Blade, obviously, than to Spider-Man.
Yeah, and that when he shows up in the cartoon, Blade shows up as well, the old like 90s cartoon or whatever. I don't know if you've ever watched that. I don't see Morbius showing up. You're right. It's Morgan Michaels, by the way, the doctor's name, I think, right?
Yeah.
So they do use his alias, but I do not see him becoming Morbius the living vampire. That's a little bit too wacky of a side tangent to go down, I think. But it would be fun. Like, I'm not against it. I just don't see them doing it.
The only implementation I would love is if he only appeared when you were Miles, and he was Man-Bat. You know how Man-Bat appears and scares the hell out of you when you're playing Arkham City?
Yeah.
I would love that. Like, you don't necessarily ever need to fight him, but you hear whispers about there's a vampire flying around New York. You're like, what? That doesn't make any goddamn sense. But then when you're Miles, you just get... It's just one encounter. In the whole game, it's just one encounter where you're like swinging around, running up a building, and then he pops up and scares the hell out of Miles. That'd be cool with me. Just a single appearance. Or not at all. I'm with you. It was just a weird thing because usually when they make those little Easter eggs, especially when it's an actual character or not like a throwaway line, it's like there usually is some foreshadowing, but there was like zero. There wasn't like...
Maybe it might have just been like a way for them to nod to Morbius or whatever, or something like that, and keep it kind of simple like that or something.
They mentioned Chameleon in the side mission where you find out there's a Spider-Man vigilante who's dressing up in a very bad costume or pretending to be you. He mentions, I wonder if this is Chameleon. Not much there. Obviously, Chameleon is a shapeshifter. Possibly he could be in a side mission. I would like if he was like in a mission that wasn't necessarily based around combat. Like you're just trying to figure out where Chameleon is, right? He's like hidden in a crowd or something, and he's shapeshifting.
I would just like it if he just showed up. Like you're totally not expecting it, and then all of a sudden, like boom, he appears somewhere, and you're like, oh shoot, what the heck? Like the last thing you were expecting was Chameleon to appear because. Like I don't know, Chameleon's a villain I think a lot of people have strayed away from writing the past few years as well, because he's just kind of, I don't know, he's very old school Spider-Man villain, but we haven't seen a new interesting take on him in quite some time, and I would be down to see that with from Insomniac. But I don't know how they would tie that in necessarily.
Sandman was mentioned in one of the backpacks. He has a vial of sand, and Peter jokes that if I open this, I wonder if he comes back to life. Sandman would be I think a cool side mission with everything we're talking about with the black suit and all this stuff. It's fine. You could leave him for the third game or not at all. Like I'm fine with not having Sandman. Yeah. It's whatever.
Sandman would the one reason I would love to see Sandman. The one reason I would love to see the next person I know we've got here listed as well is Mysterio, because they could do so many cool things visually with both of them, especially where we're at now with like 4K TVs and PS4 Pros and all that stuff. And I assume this next game will be PS5 as well, so we'll be have even more technology to work with for that game. I think they could do a lot of really, really cool sequences with both of those characters. Sandman's almost too big of a villain, though, to throw in as a side character, though. Like, I don't know. He's like I don't know. We could see. Maybe Sandman breaks the Sinister Six out of the prison or something like that, and then they're still running around the city. I don't know. I'd like to see him in it. I don't know how they write him in, though, because I don't think he's going to be written into the through-line larger narrative, especially since it's already been established that Peter's had past run-ins with him. It seems like what they're doing with the larger overall narrative is they're having him have run-ins with these new characters that he's never come across before. Like, that's why we see Doc Ock come about, and that's why we see Mr. Negative come around and stuff like that. So I think they're focused on the new characters for the main story path, and I don't know. He'd be good as like a side tangent to go down or something like that.
For Mysterio, I really hope that he's introduced before he becomes Mysterio, and it's like he's filming a documentary about Spider-Man or something, or
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, something like weird, or like he's running a carnival or something. I would love if it was that, and then he's a villain in the third game. I would love to just see Mysterio mentioned. Him to me too personally is like too big to be a side character, like to be like in a Tombstone side mission thing. But if they did it cleverly, where it's not specifically Mysterio at the height of his powers, but it's like there's just like guy using special effects to like rob banks and stuff, and you're like, what the hell is that? You know, like something like that, something smaller scale than him like being at Mysterio at large would be interesting. Lizard, Kurt Connors. This is an interesting one because I think this is highly likely dependent on where Peter's working. I think if Peter ends up working at another lab, I think they could easily introduce Kurt Connors, right? Whether he becomes the Lizard in this game or not, they could easily introduce Kurt Connors. But if he's at the Daily Bugle, like how do you fit that in? Miles is also into science. You can usher that in where Miles has like a college teacher, a college professor that's Kurt Connors. I think Lizard is, out of these ones that were mentioned that were teased, I think Lizard could be pretty likely. But he already exists in this universe because somebody's wearing the Lizard costume at the party. It was the other doctor who got killed. So he already exists, but we didn't hear any tangent or a side story about him at all. So we don't know if like he's dead, if he's alive,
if he's eating his son.
Yeah,
if you're familiar with that story.
Yeah,
I don't know. Just Lizard is a good candidate for a side story within the game. I think I'm not like the hugest fan of Lizard. I don't know how you feel about him. He's good. I agree that he's a good.
I think he's good, not great. I think he's like a good like number 2 character to a better narrative, like overall.
Yeah, totally. I agree. I've never read like a single Lizard story and have been like, oh, I'm blown away by this Lizard. Actually, that's not true. There's actually a very good Lizard story in the Spider-Man series, the one that Todd McFarlane drew for a while. There's actually a pretty good Lizard story in there where Lizard kind of goes nuts. And then also the one where he eats his son, but that one's kind of weird. That's some Dan Slott writing for you. I think that he'd be a good candidate for like a little side story they could go down in, because you would assume he's got a previous relationship with Dr. Connors or whatever. So
yeah,
kind of all naturally works together.
So real quick, Tarantula is going to be in Spider-Geddon number 0, which takes place in the Spider-Man PS4 universe. So that's why I have him written down here. He is like a C or D list villain. It's weird that he's coming back. There was rumors that he was actually going to be in the game, but he was like a cut towards like midway through production. I think he's a perfect candidate for a side mission. He's like one of those like Tarantula. Really, he names himself Tarantula.
Yeah,
and he actually fits in with Silver Sable being somebody who comes from another country to try to like, obviously she's a mercenary, so it's different, but there's ties there of people coming from other countries to Manhattan, so they could totally play around with that. Now, unknown but possible. So these are characters that weren't mentioned at all in the game, but are very possible. The last one, not so much. I'll get him out of the way. Boomerang. Boomerang is like a div list villain for Spider-Man. I just think he's funny. In the new Amazing Spider-Man, I actually really like the idea of having Spider-Man, Peter Parker, room with a villain. And the fact that he can't pay his, it's an ongoing thing with Peter, is that he's terrible at just being a regular person. That'd be a funny thing, a side thing of like him living with the villain. And like Boomerang is so small time that you wouldn't have to dwell on it that much. Like he can find out later through a side mission that his roommate is a villain, but it's not like, oh, he's somebody crazy. It's like, oh, he's this Boomerang dude that like robs convenience stores. So
yeah,
it's possible.
No, that would be a good fun little side thing. I agree. Boomerang's funny, like you were saying.
Miles is in this game, or it's going to be in the sequel. So Prowler is possible. That could be a huge thing for Miles specifically, dealing with Aaron Davis, his uncle. So
I think if you want to flesh out, if you want to have like maybe Miles have his own personal side story, I think that would be obviously a great way to do so. That's because the Prowler story arc is just as integral to Miles as that's his Uncle Ben moment within the series for all intents and purposes. So like it's very important that I think they touch on that.
And you can make it that Prowler's stealing from Oscorp or something, because or
That's what happens in the comics. Yeah.
Yeah, well, especially with the ties of like Jefferson Davis getting killed, it's like he probably has a lot of resentment towards Mr. Negative as well as like Norman. So it's like you can tie that in of like Miles dealing with the fact that his uncle is doing things for the quote unquote right reason, but the wrong reason because he's being vengeful. So there could be a play around with that whole thing.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Keep that story very much tied to Miles and don't let Peter dip into that. The weird thing with that, though, is, and the thing that I don't know, they could still approach it, and it wouldn't be that hard, but Prowler kind of is the one who teaches Miles a lot of things early on in his own comic series, and it's obvious that Peter's probably going to be that person in the next game, so he doesn't really need to look to Aaron Davis or Prowler or whatever as like sort of a figure to learn from, and more of just like an internal family conflict that he has to deal with or whatever.
Well, in the thread there, you could do the whole thing with Peter's relationship with Doc Ock, where it's somebody he looks up to, and not necessarily as a mentor, but as like it's my uncle. It's like one of the main male idols that I have in my life left since my dad passed away, and I find out he's a criminal. So Kraven, I think the best implementation is a Taskmaster type stuff. Like make it a series of side challenges or missions where he challenges you to hunt things because Kraven's known as the greatest hunter, or you have to race him in some type of hunt or something. I think they can make that work. With Kraven, I think if you introduce him, it has to be in a fun way because he's not in the same way, but he is outlandish like Morbius, where it's like, oh, he's the greatest hunter in the world, and Spider-Man's the ultimate prey. You know what I mean? I think they.
Dude, I love Kraven. Kraven's like one of my favorites, and because he is so kind of stupid. Yeah. I don't know if you read the Ultimate Spider-Man series either. I love when he shows up in that though, and he's like, "I'm Kraven, and I'm here to prove that I'm the ultimate hunter by taking out Spider-Man." Blah 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 blah. And Spider-Man just like punches him across the face once, and he falls to the ground, and that's like their first encounter. I think Kraven is just such a wacky character, but he's also really cool, and there's a lot of good story arcs with him out there. He's like Kraven's Last Hunt's like the standout one. I think more than any other character we've talked about, I think he's ripe for some sort of side tangent content within the game, and I really hope that they use him somehow in the next one, just because I think Kraven's just fun.
Well, and the cool thing is, so with the Taskmaster challenges, he had those like cases that were above certain buildings. It would be cool if one of Kraven's challenges took place like near or above the Wakanda embassy, and you had some lines from Kraven being like, talking about Black Panther, mentioning Wakanda or whatever. You know what I mean? I think that'd be cool.
Something like that would be cool, yeah.
Yeah. So let's get into... we're going to go into Venom and then our pitch. I know we're running a little long and you got to get out of here, so I don't want to hold you too long.
No, you're fine.
So let's talk about Venom. Obviously, we talked about the symbiote and what's going to happen with it. We're going to talk about this for a little bit. So, the likeliest candidate. We know that Eddie Brock exists in this universe. He wrote the goodbye card to Peter when he left the Daily Bugle. He could be brought back into the story because, like we said, we both want Peter to be back at the Daily Bugle. That's a perfect in, right? You get back and then you're like, oh, Eddie Brock, and you talk to him and stuff like that. And you can reintroduce him as like a fully fleshed out character. Flash Thompson's in the world. When Peter walks by a Feast bulletin board, he mentions that, oh, Flash is taking care of veterans. And if you're familiar with Flash Thompson, he becomes Anti-Venom, which I don't think they'd touch on in this because it'd be too bloated. But there could be some threads there, possibly. Who knows? But he's a possibility for Venom, specifically. And then Harry, which I think is the least likely candidate. First off, do you think the symbiote will be more than just a black suit? And if so, who do you think is the likeliest candidate to become Venom?
So as we said before, I think it's going to attach to Peter first, and so he's going to go through that whole series of events. I really want them to somehow add Eddie Brock into this story. And again, he's already in the world. Like, we see his name listed there on the Daily Bugle postcard. So he like works at the Daily Bugle, or at least he previously did. Or it's not, Peter doesn't ever really specifically point him out or say anything about him. Man, like, good Eddie Brock stories though are great because he's a freaking nutcase. Like, he's this macho nut job who is hyper jealous, and I don't know. I think it would be. I would like them to find some way to just add Eddie Brock into this story and make him just become Venom rather than Flash. And I know Flash has been like the popular Venom choice over the last few years. I know they could also add it to have it attached to Matt Gargan or whatever, and they could go down the Venom Scorpion story arc, which is kind of crazy, but like I don't know. I want whoever becomes Venom to have that. The reason the whole Venom storyline is good is because it ends up attaching to somebody that Peter has issues with outside of being Spider-Man.
Yeah,
and that's why it's good, is because there's this like there's this added hatred that Venom has towards Spider-Man because, or towards Peter or whatever, because of their personal conflicts when he's got the suit off. And I like that aspect of the storyline. So I want it to be Eddie Brock. Obviously, he's not in the game yet, technically, really. Other than we know it, like I said, we know he exists in the universe.
Yeah.
So that's a confirmation enough of that. But I hope it does. They do introduce him somehow, and they can start fleshing that storyline out, because I don't know. I just, again, like, that's not like super novel to think about. I'm not like really blowing anybody's mind with that opinion, but I think the normal symbiote storyline is so good, and they don't really need to stray too far from it. If they can just, again, it's kind of like with the Dr. Octopus and Peter conflict in this game, like, it's just they further contextualize that relationship so that by the time they did start fighting or whatever, it felt like it had very high stakes. If they could do the same thing here between Peter and Eddie, once the symbiote attaches to Eddie, like, it would be really, really cool, I think.
So, yeah, it's tough, because it's like, how much of that story are they going to do in this game specifically? Like, is it just going to be Black Suit Peter, and then the teaser for the next game is Venom, you know? So my scenario that I could see playing out, and whether this is right or wrong, who knows, right? But my idea is that the symbiote attaches to Peter. We go through that whole storyline. If Peter is working at the Daily Bugle, and even if he's not, by the end of the game, I don't think him and Mary Jane are going to still be together. Obviously, if he's in the black suit, I think it's going to cause a lot of stuff with their relationship. And I think by the end of this game, they're not going to be together. And I'm not saying at the very end. I'm saying like maybe like Act 2. And then I think that you could play into a storyline where Eddie Brock ends up flirting and possibly dating Mary Jane. Maybe not like hardcore, but that could be a thread there where Peter starts to get a little jealous, obviously, and they start having issues there. And Eddie Brock is Venom. I'm with you. Flash Thompson has been the popular choice, but I mean, I like Venom most when he attaches to somebody who isn't necessarily. I like when they're morally black. I don't necessarily like when they're like, because Flash Thompson, especially in this, he's like helping veterans and stuff. He's very nice. I want like a psychotic Venom. And that's the weird thing, is like in the first Spider-Man, though we had Scorpion, he wasn't like psychotic Scorpion. Like, he wasn't psychotic Matt Gargan. Like, all of them, you know, Vulture had cancer. Rhino didn't want a suit anymore. Electro, I guess he was probably the most psychotic. He just wanted more power. And then Scorpion just wanted to get relieved of his charges, which I thought was very weird. And like, that doesn't sound like a Matt Gargan thing of like, yeah, I'm doing this so you can clear my record. So I would love if it was. I like Scorpion, don't get me wrong, but I found that weird. I would love if he was more of the psychotic Venom. Yeah, I think the one I definitely don't want is Harry. I don't want that. That's happened in the storyline before, and I'm not a fan of that personally. It's just like, I don't gel with.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, Harry Venom, no thank you. Also, no thank you to Goblin Venom or Goblin Carnage or whatever from the previous. I like that Dan Slott went out on his most recent run by telling the most crazy story he possibly could be, by being like, oh, I'll combine Green Goblin and Carnage or whatever. Like, I don't know if you read that story or whatever. It's freaking wacky as can be. But yeah, nothing too crazy like that. Like, again, I'm very fine with seeing these conventional Spider-Man storylines and plot lines play out, but have them play out in the way that Insomniac tells it. Because they did remain, obviously they changed certain things about the Doc Ock origin and stuff like that in this game, but it wasn't like super drastic or anything like that. Like, at the end of the day, he still became a dude with 4 mechanical arms who's a psychopath and is running around the city, and he's a leader of the Sinister Six. Like, the path they took to eventually get to that point was different, but it was like, once they got there, it was like generally the same thing.
Exactly. It was about the journey, not the destination.
Yeah. So, And I'm totally fine with them doing the same thing with Venom in the next game. So do you think, I mean, I guess my question for you is this. Do you think they do the Venom stuff in the next game, though, or do you think they save that for a later one? Or do you think the next game is the black suit stuff, like, for sure?
I think for sure. We're going to go into our plot stuff and what we think the overall plot is. And I think the black suit and all of that is, like, super crucial. Sorry. But I don't think we see Venom in this game. I think we get the black suit, and I think Venom is the main villain in the third game, and I think Carnage is possible. So if Venom is in the sequel, I think we'll see Carnage in 3. If Venom is in the third game, I don't know if we'll see Carnage a whole lot. You know, it's tough.
I would prefer we don't see Carnage, honestly.
Same, yeah.
I'm not like a huge Carnage fanboy. He's just like crazier Venom. Like that's about it in a general sense.
Yeah.
I think as far as like overall plots for the next game, black suit makes the most sense. I think it allows you to explore some new areas of Peter's character as well at the same time, especially coming off of what we did here in this game. And I think not only that, but I think the enhanced what am I trying to think? Not arrogance, that's the wrong word. The enhanced toxicity and just like evilness or whatever that would exude from aggressiveness. There we go. Yeah. The enhanced aggression from Peter and seeing how that would play out with his relationships with not only Mary Jane but with Miles as well, because Miles would be looking to Peter. I think that would be the most interesting thing, actually, is if it just attaches to Peter and Peter kind of loses it, and then you have to have like a boss fight situation where you take control of Miles and he has to fight Peter or something like that. Like something like that would be cool, where this black suit like really messes Peter up, and not only do you see how he treats like villains, and he's like other enemies in the game, and he's like going way too brutal and beating the crap out of them way too much more than normal, but like you also see how it affects the other characters in this game who we've already become familiar with because we've been in their shoes and stuff like that. So with Mary Jane and with Miles, and I think that's a very interesting avenue for them to go down, like this sort of the dark middle chapter or dark second chapter of this saga of whatever they're going to make, where Peter really, really loses himself in this next game. And that would also set up a lot of good things. That would be a good hero's journey for Miles, to where he has to stop leaning upon Peter to learn how to become Spider-Man, and he has to kind of take up that mantle more quickly because Peter's kind of gone deranged because of the suit and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of good things they can do within that structure. And then you got to throw in Green Goblin as well, because I feel like or maybe they'll save the Green Goblin for the third game, honestly. Maybe the next one, it would just be good if they continue laying the groundwork there with Norman Osborn. They focus on all the black suit stuff. They do the Venom. They find a way to make Miles his own character at the same time with some of those things I mentioned, and we kind of do this whole story arc, and then the third game can be finally when Norman Osborn goes crazy, and you can finally build up to arguably Spider-Man's biggest villain for the final game or whatever, assuming there's 3 games in this trilogy or whatever.
So I like, it's funny, a lot of the stuff you said was stuff that I had is part of like my idea of what the game is going to be, especially like when you got into Miles. So I'll try to as best communicate this. So what I think the pitch is the pitch for the overall plot in the second game is that you start the game, everything is going jolly, Harry's back with MJ and Peter, yada yada yada. The symbiote attaches itself to Peter, right? So the first act is basically dealing with the city as it is now, post the Sinister Six and all of that stuff, and Peter building back a relationship with Harry who's been gone, right? And figuring out, like, now that he's possibly working at the Daily Bugle, figuring out where he sits in this world and talking to Miles. I think Act 2 is, and him getting the black suit, right? In Act 1, he gets the black suit from the symbiote, and he's like, what's this? And he starts to like it, and it's like, oh, this gives me added abilities, I really like this. By Act 2, I think that's when Peter starts snapping, right? He starts going bad. And they can even tie this in gameplay-wise of, like, you stop doing stuff, but the animation and stuff goes a little bit further than what Peter would, right? Mm-hmm. And he starts going off the deep end. and you play as Miles, and you play as Miles. So at that point in the game, during Act 2, Miles is the hero, and Peter's kind of like the villain. And there is Act 2 culminates in Miles fighting Peter and taking him down. And at that point, you lose the black suit, and Peter loses the black suit.
Maybe. Well, sorry to interject real quick. Maybe Miles is like the zap ability. He's got that little venom zap. Yep. Maybe that like gets the symbiote to jump off of him somehow or something like that. If that makes any sense.
And remember, the spider that bit Miles was from the same lab where the symbiote was. So maybe there's a connection there to where he doesn't have the weakness to it or whatever. They could tie that in somehow. So yeah, the second act you're playing as Miles for the majority of it, and Peter's the villain, and it culminates in a boss battle with him. Obviously, through this whole thing, there's a narrative with Norman and Harry, right? And Norman kind of losing his mind. Third act, what happens in the third act is Peter's back to being normal. He doesn't have the black suit anymore. At this point, we figure out through maybe little Easter eggs or animations or cutscenes that the symbiote made its way to Eddie Brock or Flash Thompson or whatever, and Peter in the third act, Peter's trying to deal with Norman Osborn being Green Goblin. And I think however that pans out, I think the game culminates in Spider-Man accidentally killing Norman. Not because of the Venom suit, but it's just some weird ass accident that happens where Peter doesn't.
He does a backflip and the glider impales him.
Yes, that iconic scene. Or it could be something to where that's our first. Imagine if the first scene of the Venom is Peter having an intimate fight with the Green Goblin, and for some reason, whoever Venom ends up being, I don't think it's Harry, but Eddie Brock or somebody, ends up killing Green Goblin. But because not a whole lot of people saw it, people assume it was Spider-Man. It's kind of one of those things, right? Where like, oh, Spider-Man killed Green Goblin, but it was actually Venom. And that leads to the crux of the third game, where Venom is a villain, but also Harry loses his mind. And that's where Harry's like, I hate Spider-Man. He killed my father. Because I think through the whole narrative, it'll be Harry's like, my father gave me a second life. It wasn't the best option, but I'm still living and breathing, right?
Yeah, because Norman does have a weirdly like sentimental vibe about him at the very end of that game, like saying like, "Oh, I will save you, son," or "I will heal you," something along those lines. And it's like seems like he like does genuinely care, and that like saving Harry isn't just some sort of like pet side project he's got.
Yeah.
So like, despite their like weird relationship and how Harry doesn't really like Norman, and that's further established in the book as well. The prequel book that I read, they really have a terrible relationship, or at least from Harry's perspective they do, but it seems like Norman does actually care about him to a certain degree, and maybe like, yeah, if he dies, that would dawn on Harry. Also, for the record, you are setting up the natural third game to be legitimately Spider-Man 3, where the villains are Harry, Green Goblin, and Venom.
I guess, yeah. And the way I would position it is that Doc Ock is manipulating this whole situation, the thread throughout, right? Because that's the way they made him seem, is that he's the guy pulling all the puppet strings. And in the third game, you could actually see the return of the Sinister Six, but not the one we met in Game 1. The Sinister Six in Game 3 could be Venom, Doc Ock, Harry, whatever mantle he takes up, depending on what he wants to call himself, and a couple of maybe returning villains, right? Maybe it could be Kraven if he's sprinkled in the second game. Maybe it's a different character. But it would be a different Sinister Six, still led by Doc Ock, and that'd be interesting. It just, I really think that the middle core of this game, the Act 2, if they're doing the black suit, has to be where Peter loses it, and it will be a really powerful moment when you have to defeat the character you've been playing for a game and a half with Miles.
Yeah,
like I think that would be great. What if the first time you control Miles is not necessarily to fight Peter, but it's like when Peter goes off the deep end, instead of at the beginning of the game letting you be Miles just out of the gate? I think that'd be a lot more powerful. And then once you beat the game, you unlock the ability to wear the black suit, because before that it wouldn't make sense contextually to be able to wear it in the third act. And you also unlock the ability to switch between Miles and Peter at the end of the game too in free roam. So I don't know. We're
on the same page in a lot of those, in a lot of these ways, obviously.
Yeah, and I don't think when the game comes out, I don't think it'll be far too off from what we think. But there will be surprises, obviously. But I think a lot of the main points are points that you not necessarily need to hit in a Spider-Man game, but are like can't miss opportunities. And like we said, it doesn't matter if they pick stories or points that we've already heard or read or seen.
Yeah.
It's how well we get to those points. And that's one thing that blew me away about Spider-Man is that, yeah, the story is like you expect that story, but the writing, performances, and voice acting were like phenomenal. I'm like, I'll eat this up 10 more times. And
Yes.
I'm fine with seeing, like you said, the lead to Spider-Man 3 told by somebody who didn't make Spider-Man 3, you know?
Exactly.
So
yeah, somebody who knows how to make a good version of Spider-Man 3. Exactly.
Before we head out, we're going to be doing another talk post DLC, probably sometime next year. I want to get Logan back in so we could talk about our feelings on Black Cat specifically and Silver Sable and the DLC ramifications for the narrative, though I don't think they'll affect the main campaign in any way, but we'll see. But before we go, Logan, please let everybody know where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me just in a general sense, I guess, or whatever, over on Twitter. I am at moreman12. Is for my other stuff that I do. Yeah, as you mentioned at the top of the show, dualshockers.com. We have got a lot of good stuff I'm always writing up over there, whether it be reviews or op-eds or anything of that sort. We're also starting a new podcast over there soon as well, so if you want to listen to more words be spoken out of my mouth with some other fine folks who write over at Dual Shockers as well, you can find us there. I don't know what it's called yet or what it'll be. I don't know. I don't have those details yet. All I know is that we're launching a new podcast relatively soon, probably after this episode goes out, I would have to imagine. So, yeah, just dualshockers.com for all that stuff, and check out our site and, yeah, read our stuff.
Also, they're called Dual Shockers, but they cover more than just PlayStation. I don't know if that's a misinterpretation that people are like, oh, they only cover PlayStation.
That's a very common misinterpretation. But, yeah, no, we cover everything over there.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me, Logan. If you guys can, please follow us on Twitter at CTRLINT. That's Controlled Interest Abbreviated. I personally am at Jared_. It was cool to talk about our wish list and our dreams for the sequel. We're also going to have a spoiler mode up where Jordan, Dom, and I talk about Spider-Man as a whole, the game itself, what we thought about it in terms of the narrative and stuff like that. You know, you kind of heard from me on this episode how much I enjoyed it. But, yeah, once again, thank you, Logan, for joining me. And we'll catch you guys next time. Bye.